I read a Spectator article just today by Patrick West, who was commenting on the recent British Social Attitude Survey. So he said, according to the British Social Attitude Survey 2023, just 64% of the public said they were proud or very proud of Britain's history, down from 86% in 2013, and the lowest this has been since the question was first asked in 1995. So some commentators, Peter, say that we're living in a war on the past. And I suppose unconnected with the survey, I've heard David Starkey recently say that this isn't so much the death of England, but the attempted murder. Do you agree that there has been a war in the past and this might be contributing to a lack of faith in the country?
Oh, I don't doubt it. In my first book, which is now a quarter of a century old, The Abolition of Britain, I devoted part of the book to an examination of the way in which history teaching had changed, and that the whole attitude towards our past, which had previously been common, normal, university taught, had been abandoned and replaced with one which was much more critical. And I'm not actually against being critical of the past. Many things happened in the past which were very bad, and some of the things that we're taught about the past probably need to be revised. I think it's a basic, what is jeered at as drum and trumpet history has its faults. So I'm not completely against people saying let's teach it in some ways differently and reflect on some of the things in the past that we previously not mentioned. The problem is it hasn't been done for that reason. It hasn't been done to give people a fuller, a richer and more balanced picture of the past. It's been used to try to validate the present by making the past look worse than it was. And this is always the technique of revolutionary governments, revolutionary states, revolutionary movements. It's actually at the heart of George Orwell's 1984, the obliteration of any true information about the past, which makes it possible for the ruling party to suggest to everybody that the world they live in, horrible as it is far, far better than it was under the old regime. And I think that has been happening. I'm almost surprised at the figures that 64% still do feel a pride in the British past after the belaboring that this idea has been receiving in schools and universities and indeed on the BBC for so long. But I think it's plain that they have succeeded to some extent, particularly among those who are too young to have had any other experience. And the other thing, of course, which was accelerated since I wrote my book, that it had certainly begun when I did so, is the disintegration of the old-fashioned tight-knit family in which the law of the past was carried from one generation to another. And the schools didn't play so much of a part in it, and media didn't play so much of a part in it, and social media didn't play so much of a part in it. So things that I grew up believing, thinking I knew, whether they were literary or historical or cultural, were passed on to me by my parents and my uncles and my aunts and my grandfather. Nowadays, I think an awful lot of children simply don't have that source. All they get is the public sources, and all the public sources are devoted to suggesting that the past was a time of cruelty, scarcity, misery, abuse of various kinds, and oppression. And it's not surprising that they come to believe that. But the real reason for all these attacks on the past is undoubtedly to make people more content with the very unsatisfactory present.
How did that change occur? So it sounds to me as though you're describing a world in which both a governing class and even people in the everyday had this concept of stewardship, where they weren't the owners of something, they felt they had to pass something on, they had to keep it going. And yet we've now moved into a world of, I suppose, to use corporate speak, change makers. Everyone wants to be revolutionary in some way. And we tend to live in the present and don't really have a link to the past or think about ancestral stuff. It sounds like you felt that change begin to occur. What was behind that?
When I first looked into it, I thought, well, maybe there is some, because I myself, as a former Marxist-Leninist, would tend to assume that some things which looked as if they were they had just occurred naturally might conceivably be achieved by action, by propagandists. And I've no doubt that in some professions and in some areas of the media there have been groups of people working with purpose to try and change this, quite in some cases quite openly. I think there were societies among teachers, for instance, who wanted to change the teaching of history and change the teaching of English, and succeeded in doing so. But such groups of people have existed, I should think, probably for at least a century and probably longer in this country. The thing is that during the 1960s, particularly, and afterwards, they became much more successful than they'd been before. I think this was because that was the point at which the old authorities, the authorities in religion, authorities in knowledge, authorities in morals, whatever they might be, had all begun to disintegrate. And particularly they disintegrated because what you might call Christendom had been dealt a completely fatal blow during the 1914-18 war. And that really began to have its most profound effects in the 1960s, as the last generation of those who'd been brought up before the change began to disappear and a new generation came into being. Fascinating to remember, I'm so old. In 1964, the BBC made a tremendous series on the First World War, a television series, one of the best things it's ever done. And one of the most gripping things about it was the number of people they were able to interview who were still, although old, were still healthy and compos mentis enough to give direct eyewitness personal accounts of the years before and during the First World War. And those people were still around. And in the years afterwards, they disappeared quite rapidly, as such people do, as they grew old and died, and ceased to be influential in society. So I think that shows you that the general moral and educational catastrophe caused by the First World War finally began to have its deepest effects in the 1960s and afterwards, which is also the era when the British education system was more or less destroyed by the destruction of the state grammar schools and the vast expansion of the universities, which hasn't stopped since. And also the time, of course, when television became a very conformist force and largely under the control of people with Bloomsbury ideas and Bloomsbury morals from then on, began to become a really dominant force, even more so when colour television was introduced later in the decade.